Britain has villages that once you know the stories attached to them, they start to feel very different. Some are known for ghost sightings, some are wrapped in old folklore, and others were abandoned. For this video, we have researched 9 of Britain's creepiest villages, from Pluckley in Kent, long promoted as one of England's most haunted villages, to Wharram Percy in Yorkshire, one of Britain's best preserved, deserted medieval villages. So let's begin with section 1. The villages said to be haunted. At first glance, Pluckley does not look like the sort of place that should frighten anyone. Set in the Kent countryside, surrounded by fields, orchards, narrow lanes, and old timber-framed houses, it has the kind of quiet English beauty that looks almost too perfect. On a bright afternoon, you might pass through and think you had found one of those villages that time had been kind to. There are cottages, church walls, country roads, and old buildings that seem to belong to another age. But would you believe that this peaceful village has also carried one of the darkest reputations in Britain? For decades, Pluckley has been described as one of the most haunted villages in the country. Some sources say it was once listed in the Guinness Book of Records as the most haunted village in Britain, with around 12 reported ghosts connected to the area. Other accounts stretch that number even higher, depending on who is telling the story and which local legends they include. But what makes Pluckley so interesting is not just the number of ghost stories. It is how specific they are. These are not vague tales of a shadow seen somewhere in the distance. In Pluckley, the ghosts have names, locations, habits, and histories. They are attached to crossroads, woods, churchyards, lanes, and old estates, almost as if the village itself has become a map of things that were never properly laid to rest. One of the most famous stories is that of the Red Lady. She is said to haunt the churchyard of St. Nicholas, the parish church that stands in the heart of the village. According to local tradition, the Red Lady is connected to the Dering family, once one of the most important families in the area. The story often says she wanders the churchyard, searching for the grave of her stillborn child. There is something deeply sad about that image. Not a screaming spirit. Not a monster, just a woman, still searching after all these years, moving among the stones as if grief itself had learned how to walk. Then there is the White Lady, another figure linked to the same wider local history. She is often said to appear near the old Dering estate, sometimes connected to the ruins of a chapel. Like many old English ghost stories, the details shift depending on who tells it. Some say she is also connected to the Dering family. Others simply describe her as a pale shape glimpsed where no living person should be standing. And get this, in villages like Pluckley, that is often how these stories survive, not through one official version, but through repeated whispers. Someone sees something, someone tells a neighbour, a detail changes, another detail remains exactly the same. Over time, the story becomes part of the place. But if Pluckley has one location that seems to draw the most attention, it is the area known as the Screaming Woods. Even the name sounds like something from a warning rather than a map. These woods, also known in some accounts as Dering Woods, have long been associated with reports of strange cries and unexplained shrieks. Visitors have claimed to hear screams coming from among the trees, only to find no one there. Others describe a sense of being watched, or a sudden drop in atmosphere as they move deeper into the woodland. Now, of course, woodland can play tricks on the mind. Branches rub together, foxes cry in the dark, wind moves strangely through trees. The scary part is, when a place already has a reputation, every sound begins to feel like it means something. And maybe that is part of Pluckley's power. The village does not need to show you anything, it only needs you to know what people have said about it. Once you have heard the stories, a normal lane does not feel quite normal anymore. A churchyard becomes more than a churchyard. A shadow near a hedge makes you look twice. That is how folklore works. It changes the way you see a place before anything has even happened. Another well-known haunting is said to take place at Fright Corner, a name that does not exactly invite confidence. This crossroads has been linked to the ghost of a highwayman, sometimes said to have met a violent end there. The story goes that his spirit still lingers near the place where his life ended, replaying the final moments or appearing as a dark figure by the roadside. Crossroads have always had a strange place in folklore. They are meeting points, boundaries, and places of choice. Roads lead away in different directions, and in old stories, places like that often seem to attract the restless dead. Pluckley also has the tale of a schoolmaster said to haunt the area near the playing fields. In some versions, he is seen hanging from a tree, a grim and unsettling image that feels far removed from the pretty village shown to passing visitors. There are also reports of a phantom coach and horses, a monk-like figure, and other apparitions tied to lanes, bridges, and buildings around the village. Whether every story began with a real sighting, an old tragedy, or simply the natural growth of local legend is impossible to say now. But in Pluckley, the sheer number of stories creates its own atmosphere. One ghost story might be dismissed, two might be coincidence, but when nearly every corner of a village has a tale attached to it, people begin to wonder why. Even the pubs and older buildings have become part of the legend. The Black Horse, a historic village pub, is often mentioned in connection with strange activity. Accounts connected to the village speak of glasses breaking, objects moving, cold spots, and the smell of tobacco appearing where no one has been smoking. Now here's where things get strange. These are the kinds of details that appear again and again in haunted pub stories across Britain. A smell that should not be there. A room that suddenly feels colder than the rest. A noise after closing time. A glass that falls when nobody is near it. Small things, yes, but small things are often what unsettle people most, because they feel ordinary enough to be believable. But there is another side to Pluckley's story, and it is important to mention it. Not everyone in the village welcomes the haunted reputation. For some residents, Pluckley is not a ghost attraction. It is home. It is where people live, work, raise families, walk dogs, and try to have ordinary lives. Every famous haunted village has this problem. The legend brings attention, but attention is not always respectful. Ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and curious visitors may arrive looking for fear, while locals are simply trying to protect the peace of the place. So if Pluckley is spoken about as haunted, it should also be spoken about as real. A real village. Real people. Real history beneath the folklore. And that may be why Pluckley works so well as the first village in this journey. It gives us the classic haunted Britain image. The churchyard, the dark woods, the old pub, the crossroads, the pale figures seen where no one should be. But it also asks a quieter question. What happens to a place when its stories become more famous than the people who live there? Does the haunting belong to the village, or does the village become trapped inside the haunting? Could you imagine walking there after sunset, knowing all of this before you even arrive? The lanes would look the same as they did in daylight, but they would not feel the same. The churchyard would sit quiet behind its walls. The trees would gather into darker shapes beyond the fields. Somewhere near Fright Corner, a car might pass and disappear down the road. Then the silence would come back, thicker than before, and even if nothing happened, even if no figure appeared and no scream came from the woods, you might still find yourself listening, because in Pluckley, that is the real power of the stories. They make you listen to the dark. And once you start listening, the village feels as though it is listening back. After Pluckley, we move west into Gloucestershire, to a village that does not always shout about its reputation in the same way, but may be just as unsettling. Prestbury sits on the edge of Cheltenham, close enough to feel connected to the modern world, yet old enough to carry the weight of another time. It has pretty houses, old lanes, a parish church, and that quiet village look that can fool you if you are only passing through. But Prestbury has long been described as one of the most haunted villages in England. Some even claim it has more reported apparitions per square mile than almost anywhere else in the country. Now, that kind of claim is always difficult to prove, because ghost stories do not exactly line up neatly in a filing cabinet. But the reputation has stayed with Prestbury for years, and what makes the village so interesting is the feeling that its ghosts are not random. They seem tied to old paths, old buildings, and old boundaries, as if they are still following a map the living world has forgotten. One of Prestbury's best-known hauntings is the figure called the Black Abbot. He is said to appear near Reform Cottage, moving through the building and its walls, as though the modern structure means nothing to him. That detail is important. In many old village ghost stories, spirits are not always seen walking along the roads we use today. They follow older routes, forgotten paths, medieval tracks, lines that once mattered but have since been buried beneath houses, gardens, and tarmac. And that is what makes the Black Abbot so eerie. He is not usually described as rushing, attacking, or trying to frighten anyone. He simply moves through the place as if he still belongs there. Could you imagine seeing something like that? A dark monk-like figure passing through a wall, not because it wants attention, but because the wall is the new thing. To him, maybe the wall is not there at all. There is something deeply unsettling about that idea. Most ghost stories are frightening because they suggest the dead have returned. But Prestbury's stories suggest something slightly different. They suggest the past never fully left. It is still walking the same lines, even while the village has changed around it. Another strange figure linked to Prestbury is the medieval messenger on horseback. He is said to gallop through an area known as Burgage, close to the old boundary of the bishop's palace. Again, it is the location that gives the story its weight. This is not just a ghost horse was seen somewhere in the village. The tale places him near an old boundary, a place where power, land, and authority once meant something very real. A rider appearing there makes a strange kind of sense. Messengers belonged to roads and borders. They carried news, warnings, orders, and secrets. In a medieval world, a rider could bring news of taxes, war, death, marriage, punishment, or royal command. So when people speak of a mounted figure still moving through Prestbury, it feels less like a decorative ghost story and more like an echo of a world that once ran on hoofbeats. And get this, one of the most curious parts of Prestbury's reputation is the claim that its apparitions are often seen by newcomers. People who have lived there for generations sometimes speak about the strange things almost casually. Cold spots, odd corners, lanes where dogs refuse to walk properly, feelings that come and go. But newcomers, those who have not yet learned the rhythm of the village, seem to notice more. There is a powerful idea hidden in that. Maybe long-term residents simply get used to it. Maybe they stop looking too closely. Or maybe, in a place like Prestbury, the village teaches you what not to ask about. The scary part is, that might be more believable than any dramatic ghost encounter. Real hauntings, or at least the stories people tell about them, are often small. They are not always full-bodied figures floating in moonlight. Sometimes they are habits in a place, patterns, repeated moments, a feeling at the same bend in the road, a shape seen only from the corner of the eye, a door that never feels quite right after dark. That is Prestbury's haunting. Not a village of loud terrors, but of quiet persistence. A place where the past does not burst through the door. It simply keeps walking through the walls. And after a while, perhaps the people who live there do what people have always done in old haunted villages. They notice, they remember, and then they carry on. From the quiet lanes of Prestbury, we now move east to the Suffolk coast, where the land meets the North Sea. And here, the haunting feels different. There are no churchyard ladies in red, no dark figures walking through cottage walls, and no phantom riders following old lanes after sunset. Dunwich is stranger than that. It is a village haunted by what it has lost. In the Middle Ages, Dunwich was not just a village, it was a major port. It had churches, chapels, markets, merchants and fishermen, and a busy harbour that helped connect Suffolk to the wider world. But the sea was always waiting. Over the centuries, the coastline around Dunwich began to fall away. Storms battered the harbour, cliffs collapsed, streets vanished, houses were lost. Churches that once stood safely inland found themselves closer and closer to the edge, until the edge finally took them. The worst damage came during violent medieval storms, especially in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, when huge sections of the town were destroyed or pulled into the sea. What survived after one storm might be weakened for the next, and bit by bit, Dunwich was eaten away. The scary part is that this was not one terrible night, and then it was over. This was a slow haunting, a long disappearance. A town did not simply fall silent. It was reduced, piece by piece, generation by generation. Imagine living there and watching the sea claim the places your parents knew. A road gone, a church damaged, a neighbour's home abandoned, a graveyard edging closer to collapse. Every winter storm would have carried the same question: what will be missing when morning comes? And get this, much of old Dunwich is still out there beneath the water. Marine archaeologists and researchers have mapped remains of the lost town on the seabed. Foundations and traces of the old settlement lie beneath the North Sea, where streets and churches once stood. That is what makes Dunwich so powerful. It is not just a legend about a place that disappeared. It really did disappear. The village above ground is only the last surviving edge of something much larger. But the story that has followed Dunwich for centuries is the sound of bells. Local tradition says that during storms, when the wind is high and the sea is rough, church bells can sometimes be heard ringing from beneath the waves, from the drowned churches of old Dunwich. Now, of course, we have to be careful here. The sea is full of sound. Waves can boom against cliffs. Shingle can grind and shift under heavy surf. Wind can move over water in strange ways, and in a storm, the human mind will try to shape noise into something it understands. But still, the stories remain. Fishermen, locals, and visitors have spoken of hearing those ghostly bells for generations, and whether you believe they are truly supernatural or not, the image is unforgettable. A vanished medieval town lying under dark water, and somewhere in the storm, the sound of its churches still calling out. Could you imagine standing on the shore at Dunwich in bad weather? The sky low and bruised, the wind sharp enough to make your eyes water. The sea rising and falling in heavy, dark shapes. You look out across the water, but there is nothing to see except waves. Then, somewhere beneath all that noise, you think you hear it. A bell. Not loud, not clear enough to prove, just deep enough to make you stop breathing for a second. Then another, and suddenly the empty water does not feel empty anymore. That is the real haunting of Dunwich. It is not the idea of one ghost appearing in one place. It is the idea of an entire lost town still existing, just out of reach. A drowned world under the waves. Streets where no one walks. Churches where no one prays. Graves that may have fallen with the cliffs. Homes that once held firelight, voices, and ordinary lives, now covered by silt, tide, and silence. And that is how Dunwich fits into this journey through Britain's creepiest villages. It is not haunted in the same way as Pluckley or Prestbury. There may be no figure waiting under a tree, no monk walking through a cottage, no rider galloping along an old road. Instead, Dunwich is haunted by absence, by the shape of what used to be there, by the knowledge that beneath the waves is a town that once rang with human life. Boscastle sits on the north coast of Cornwall, tucked into a steep valley that drops down toward a narrow harbour. The cliffs rise around it, the Atlantic sits beyond the rocks, and when the weather turns, the whole village can feel cut off from the rest of the world. On a bright day, it is beautiful. But in the fading light, with the wind coming in from the sea, Boscastle has a much older feeling. The village has long been tied to sea stories, witchcraft, local legend, and old Cornish belief. It is also home to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, which has been in Boscastle since 1960. The museum was founded by Cecil Williamson and became one of the best-known collections of witchcraft and folk magic in Britain. Its history is not just about dark stories. It is about the beliefs ordinary people once used to protect themselves, heal illness, read omens, and make sense of a dangerous world. For centuries, coastal communities lived close to danger. The sea brought work, food, travel, and trade, but it could also take everything in one storm. A change in the wind could decide whether a boat returned or vanished. A sudden shift in weather could leave families waiting at the harbour with no answers. In that kind of world, people looked for protection wherever they could find it. With things like a charm in the home, or a bottle hidden in a wall, and of course a blessing before a journey. One of the strongest traditions linked with Boscastle is the story of witches who could sell the wind. According to local folklore, Boscastle witches tied knots into rope and sold them to sailors. Each knot was believed to hold a different strength of wind. Untie one, and you might get a fair breeze. Untie too many, and the weather could turn against you. The Museum of Witchcraft and Magic has even recorded this as a local Boscastle tradition, with the idea that sailors could use the knotted rope to bring a fair wind when they needed it. It sounds strange now, almost like something from an old fireside tale. But imagine being a sailor before engines, radios, and weather forecasts. You were completely at the mercy of the wind. Too little wind and you could be stranded. Too much and you could be destroyed. So if someone claimed they could offer even a little control over the weather, you can understand why people listened. That is what makes Boscastle's folklore feel believable. It grew from real fear. It came from people trying to survive in a place where nature was beautiful, but never gentle. The village itself adds to that feeling. Boscastle is still described as a working harbour, shaped by its remoteness and rugged beauty. The National Trust describes it as a small coastal village with a harbour, with the southwest coast path passing through it, and uneven ground near the harbour entrance, where the land drops toward the water. That physical setting matters. Boscastle sits in a valley, with steep sides and a harbour that feels almost hidden. When the tide is in and the wind moves through the village, it is not hard to see why people once read meaning into the weather. The meeting of water is part of the story too. Boscastle lies around the valleys of the River Valency and River Jordan, and that geography has shaped the village in very real ways. Heavy rainfall caused devastating flooding there in August 2004, when the rivers overflowed and water rushed through the village. There were no fatalities, but the damage showed just how powerful the landscape around Boscastle can become when weather turns against it. And that is where the folklore and the real place begin to meet. This is not a village where old stories feel randomly attached. The legends seem to grow out of the harbour, the valley, the sea, and the weather. That is why a tale about witches selling wind does not feel silly when placed back into its proper setting. It belongs to a coast where the weather could decide whether people lived or died. The Museum of Witchcraft and Magic adds another layer, because the objects inside are not just spooky decorations. Many are connected to real folk beliefs. People used charms because they wanted protection. They used divination because they wanted answers. They hid objects in homes because they feared bad luck, illness, curses, or unseen harm. The scary part is that folk magic often came from very ordinary fears. A sick child, maybe a storm at sea, or possibly a neighbour you did not trust. When people had no clear explanation, they reached for older answers. And in places like Boscastle, those older answers were passed down through stories, habits, and warnings. There are also modern ghost stories attached to the village. The Wellington Hotel, an old coaching inn in Boscastle, has often been linked with haunting claims. Recent travel coverage still mentions alleged hauntings in some rooms, though these should be treated as local legend rather than proven fact. Used carefully, that detail gives Boscastle a small ghost story thread without turning the whole section into a dramatic haunted hotel tale. It does not feel like folklore has been added for effect. It feels as though it belongs there. The museum, the harbour, the cliffs, the rivers, the sea wind, and the old Cornish stories all seem to fit together. Would you believe that some of the most unsettling places are not frightening because something appears in front of you, but because they make you understand why people once believed? That is Boscastle. It reminds you that folklore was not always entertainment. For many people, it was protection. It was comfort. It was a way of facing danger when there were no easy answers. Castleton sits in the Peak District, below the ruins of Peveril Castle, and close to some of Derbyshire's best-known caves. It has a different feeling from Boscastle, because this is not a village shaped by sea folklore or witchcraft. Castleton's stories come from caves, old mines, ruined walls, strange place names, and the kind of local rumours that build up slowly over time. Peveril Castle stands above the village on a rocky hilltop, overlooking the Hope Valley. English heritage says the castle was founded soon after the Norman conquest of 1066, and was already mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086, where it was linked with William Peveril. For centuries, it helped control the local area known as the Forest of the Peak, which included hunting land, timber, pasture, and valuable lead and silver mines. so the castle was part of power and control in the area. People living around Castleton would have known it as a place tied to land, law, punishment, and authority. By the 16th century, the castle had fallen into ruin, but records from Elizabeth I's reign still describe the keep as being used for the terror and punishment of offenders and for holding courts. That detail gives the place a darker edge without needing to invent anything. A castle used for judgment and punishment will always carry a different feeling from one that is only remembered for battles or royal visits. Some modern haunted location accounts mention figures around the castle, including a white knight, a phantom horse, and unexplained sounds near the ruins. These are best treated as local folklore, but they do fit the setting of an old Norman castle above a village that has lived with its presence for centuries. The caves around Castleton add another layer. Peak Cavern sits below the castle, and its old name was the Devil's Arse. It sounds crude, but it is a historic name, and the cavern still refers to it in its visitor information. The name is usually connected to the strange noises made by air and water moving through the cave, and Peak Cavern also describes its entrance chamber as the largest natural cave entrance in the British Isles. It is easy to see why people remembered a name like that. If you lived near a huge cave mouth and heard strange sounds coming from inside it, especially hundreds of years ago, the place would quickly gain a reputation. The name may sound funny now, but it tells us something important. Local people found the cave strange enough to give it a name that lasted. Peak Cavern was also part of everyday working life. Rope makers worked in the entrance chamber for generations, making rope for the local lead mining industry. The village was not just sitting beside caves for scenery. People worked around them, guided visitors through them, and built part of the local economy around what was happening underground. Other caves nearby add to the atmosphere, including Speedwell Cavern, which began as a lead mine, and Treat Cliff Cavern, known for Blue John stone. You do not need to turn the script into a cave guide, but it helps to understand that Castleton has always had a close relationship with the underground. People went below the surface for work, for mining, for money, and later, for curiosity. The village also has its hotel ghost stories. The Castle Hotel is often linked with local haunting claims, especially the story of a ghostly bride, sometimes said to have been left at the altar. Other versions mention a soldier, a nurse near the cellar, and figures seen in certain rooms or corridors. These are local claims rather than confirmed history, so they should be presented carefully, but they give Castleton a more personal ghost story thread, alongside the bigger landscape. Old hotels often collect stories like that. Guests pass through, staff notice things, and certain rooms begin to gain a reputation. A strange noise gets mentioned more than once. A cold feeling is noticed in the same part of the building. Someone sees a figure and tells the story later. Whether you believe every detail or not, those accounts become part of how people talk about the place. Mamtor sits close to the village as well, and even that has a name that sounds as if it belongs in folklore. It means Mother Hill, but it is also known as the Shivering Mountain because of frequent landslips on its eastern side. The movement was so severe that the old A625 road was eventually closed as a through road in 1979 after repeated damage. That gives Castleton another real detail that feels naturally eerie. The village is close to a ruined castle, several caves, old mines, a hotel with ghost stories, and a hill known for moving beneath the road. Put all of that together, and you can understand why folklore has stayed close to the place. Could you imagine being there after the walking crowds have gone and the village has quietened down? The pubs are still lit, but the lanes are calmer. Peveril Castle is above the rooftops. Peak Cavern sits in the gorge nearby. Somewhere under the hills, water still moves through the rock. You may not believe every ghost story connected to Castleton, but it is easy to understand why people kept telling them. The folklore survives because the setting gives it somewhere to live. Castleton does not need to be pushed into something louder than it is. Its caves, ruins, mines, old names, and local ghost stories already do the work. Pendle is one of those names that still carries a chill even 4 centuries later. In Lancashire, Pendle Hill rises over the surrounding villages with a quiet presence. It has a way of dominating the landscape around it. Fields, lanes, stone farms, and old villages sit beneath it, and from many of them, the hill is always there in the distance, watching. Today, people come to Pendle for walking, history, folklore, and the famous story of the Pendle witches. But behind the legend is something much darker than Halloween imagery. This is not really a story about witches. It is a story about poverty, suspicion, family feuds, religious fear, and a justice system that gave terrified people almost no chance. In 1612, 12 people from the area around Pendle Hill were accused of witchcraft. Most were poor. Several were elderly. Many came from families already viewed with suspicion by their neighbours. In a hard rural world, where illness, failed crops, sudden death, and bad luck needed an explanation, the accusation of witchcraft could become a weapon. A neighbour's grudge, a family rivalry, a strange reputation, a muttered threat. Any of it could become dangerous. And get this, in Pendle, the chain of events began with something almost painfully small. A young woman named Alison Device met a peddler called John Law. She wanted pins, which were useful and valuable items at the time. There was a disagreement. Soon afterwards, Law suffered what was described as a sudden illness or collapse. In the world of 1612, that was enough to raise the question people feared most. Had he been bewitched? From there, the story widened. Local magistrate Roger Nowell began investigating. Accusations spread through the Device and Chattox families, two poor families already tied to local suspicion. Old arguments were pulled into the open. People gave statements. Some confessed. Others named neighbours. And before long, what may have begun as a single argument had become one of the most infamous witch trials in English history. The scary part is how quickly fear can become official. The trials took place in August 1612. Most of the accused were sent to Lancaster Castle, where they waited in prison before facing the assizes. The accused included names that have become fixed in Lancashire folklore: Elizabeth Southerns, known as Demdike; Anne Whittle, known as Chattox; Alison Device; Elizabeth Device; James Device; Anne Redfern; Alice Nutter; Catherine Hewitt; John Balcock, and Jane Balcock. But it is important to remember that these were not characters from a legend. They were people. Now here's where the Pendle story becomes especially disturbing. One of the key witnesses was a child, Janet Device, who was only 9 years old. She gave evidence against members of her own family, including her mother, brother, and sister. In most situations, a child's testimony would have been treated with caution, but witchcraft cases often bent the usual rules. Fear made people listen differently. And when a frightened child speaks inside a courtroom already waiting for witches, the result can be deadly. The trial moved quickly. By the end, 10 people connected to the Pendle case were condemned and hanged. Lancaster Castle records state that on August 20th, 1612, 10 condemned prisoners were taken to the moors above the town and executed. There is a place in this story called Malkin Tower, often described as the meeting place where some of the accused were said to have gathered. Its exact history and location have been debated, but in the trial narrative, it became one of the key images. The supposed witches' meeting, the place where fear gave itself a setting. In many ways, Malkin Tower shows how these stories work. Once a place is named, the imagination gathers around it. A ruined or vanished building can become more powerful than a standing one because people fill the empty space with what they fear. Pendle's folklore comes from something more human and more uncomfortable: the fear of neighbours, the cruelty of suspicion, and the danger of a community deciding who does not belong. Wharram Percy is one of the best-known deserted medieval villages in Britain. The village sits in a remote valley in the Yorkshire wolds, where the outlines of lost buildings are still visible in the grass, and the ruined church of St. Martin stands as the clearest reminder that a whole community once lived there. English heritage says Wharram Percy was occupied for around 600 years. It was probably founded in the 9th or 10th century, and it was at its strongest between the 12th and early 14th centuries, when members of the Percy family held land there. Around the ruined church, the earth still shows the shapes of 2 manor houses, roughly 40 peasant houses, outbuildings, and the old layout of the settlement. It is not a village you walk through in the usual sense. You have to read it from the ground, because most of what was once there has sunk back into the landscape. It is described as one of the largest and best preserved of Britain's roughly 3,000 known, deserted medieval villages, and it has been studied by archaeologists for more than 60 years. That amount of research makes the silence feel even stranger, because this is not an imaginary lost village. It has been measured, excavated, mapped, and studied, but it still feels like a place holding something back. During excavations, researchers discovered human remains that showed signs of unusual treatment after death. Some bones had been cut, broken, burned, and separated in ways that did not fit normal burial practice. A study involving Historic England and the University of Southampton examined these remains and suggested that the treatment may have been connected to medieval fears of revenants or the walking dead. In simple terms, some medieval communities believed that certain corpses could rise from their graves and trouble the living, so the bodies might be damaged after death to stop them returning. That detail gives the village a very different kind of darkness. It is one thing to imagine an abandoned village. It is another to realize that some people who lived there may have feared their own dead. The evidence does not prove a ghost story in the modern sense, and it should not be treated like one. What it shows is something even more interesting, a real glimpse into medieval belief, where death did not always mean peace, and where the boundary between the living and the dead could feel dangerously uncertain. Medieval belief in the restless dead was not unusual. Stories from the period include accounts of corpses leaving graves, spreading sickness, frightening neighbours, or causing trouble until they were destroyed. Today, we might explain those stories through disease, grief, fear, guilt, or the way communities tried to make sense of sudden death. But for people living in the Middle Ages, the fear could feel completely real. If illness spread after someone died, or if a person had been disliked, feared, or considered dangerous in life, the dead body itself might become the focus of that fear. The ruined church of St. Martin adds to that feeling. English Heritage says the first stone church on the site was built in the mid-11th century, with earlier evidence of a timber church before that. The building went through several phases over the centuries, and although it is now ruined, it still gives the deserted village a centre. Churches were not just places of worship in medieval villages. They marked births, marriages, deaths, and festivals. If you walk there today, the experience would be very different from visiting a haunted inn or a castle ruin. There is space, grass, old earthworks, the church, and the valley around you. The place asks you to imagine what is missing, where a house stood, where a lane ran, where animals were kept, where children might have played, where families gathered before the village began to empty. It is not frightening because something jumps out at you. It is unsettling because the ordinary life of a whole village has almost completely vanished. There is no need to make Wharram Percy louder than it is. The facts are enough. A village occupied for 600 years, nearly empty by the early 16th century. Its houses now marked mostly by earthworks. Its church ruined, but still standing. And beneath the historical record, that darker question, what were these people so afraid of that some of the dead were treated as if they might come back? Imber sits on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, but for most of the year you cannot simply drive there and look around. The roads are controlled by the Ministry of Defence. The surrounding land is still used for military training, and access to the village is only allowed on certain public access dates. St. Giles Church states that access to Imber village, the church, and the military training area is not generally permitted outside those dates, except in rare and exceptional circumstances. So before the story even begins, Imber already has something most abandoned villages do not have: a boundary you are not supposed to cross. The village has very old roots. St. Giles Church records that there was a settlement at Imber by the 10th century, with the name appearing in a charter from 967, and the village was also recorded in 1086. For centuries, this was a real Wiltshire village, with farms, families, church life, and ordinary routines built around the land. Then, in November 1943, The village was evacuated so American troops could train for the D-Day landings. The people left during wartime, and Imber has remained in military occupation ever since. That is the basic history, but the unsettling part is what Imber became afterwards. It was not preserved as a quiet historic village. It was absorbed into a military landscape. Some buildings were damaged, altered, or replaced. Other structures appeared because the area was being used for training. When visitors are allowed in today, they are not walking through a normal abandoned village. They are entering a place where civilian life was removed and military use took over. St Giles Church is the clearest surviving link to the old village. The church's Conservation Trust calls it a church left over from a ghost village and describes it as standing deep inside the military training area on Salisbury Plain. It still has its 13th century structure, 14th century tower, medieval wall paintings, and even a rare depiction of the 7 deadly sins. The church is only open occasionally to visitors, which makes it feel even more cut off from ordinary village life. That is where Imber starts to feel properly creepy. A church is usually the heart of a village, but here the heart is still standing while the village around it has been emptied and repurposed. Visit Wiltshire describes the churchyard as looking like a typical English village scene until you notice the out-of-bounds signs around it. That is a strong image because it says everything without needing exaggeration. An old churchyard, a lost village, and military warning signs where village life should be. The old photographs make the contrast even sharper. Imber.org.uk keeps images and records of the village and the people who lived there, describing the residents as having been given 47 days' notice in 1943 before they had to leave for American troops training for the liberation of Europe. The site also points out that the village is remembered through images of real people, not just as an empty place on a map. That is important, because Imber was not always silent. It had voices, families, and everyday life before it became known as a ghost village. If you were there near the end of an open day, that feeling would probably be strongest. The visitors would begin leaving. The church would be closed again. The roads would soon return to military control. The warning signs would still be there after everyone had gone. And Imber would slip back into the strange silence it has known for decades. A village taken for war. A church left behind. Roads that open only when permission is given. And once the access ends, Imber becomes what it has been for most of the year, a ghost village on Salisbury Plain, waiting behind the warning signs. Tyneham is often called Dorset's ghost village, and for once that phrase actually fits, because the whole place feels like the remains of a life that was stopped mid-sentence. It sits in Dorset, close to Wharram Bay, inside the Lulworth Ranges. The setting is beautiful, which somehow makes the village feel stranger. You are looking at a lost village with the sea not far away, sitting in a landscape that should feel peaceful, yet the village itself feels eerie. In December 1943, the people were told to leave so the area could be used for wartime training. Before they went, a note was pinned to the door of St Mary's Church, asking that the church and houses be treated with care. It ended with the words, "We shall return one day." The villagers never came back. The official village history record shows that 252 people left on the 19th of December 1943, believing the move was temporary. But the reason the village feels creepy today is not just the sadness of that story. It is what remains when you walk through the place. There are still enough traces of the old village to make your mind fill in the missing life. You can see the church, the schoolhouse, the broken buildings, the old routes through the village, and the land falling away towards Wharram Bay. Dorset National Landscape describes it as the village where time stopped in 1943, and that is probably the simplest way to understand the feeling. The schoolhouse adds another uneasy detail because it still looks connected to everyday village life. It was built in the 1850s for local children and the surrounding farms, and although it had closed as a school before the evacuation, the building still belonged to the old community. Seeing it now, restored like a classroom, makes the village feel less like a distant ruin, and more like a place where ordinary life was interrupted. St Mary's Church has a similar effect. It still stands in the old village, and once you know about the note, it changes how you look at the building. It is no longer just an old church in an abandoned place. It becomes the point where the villagers left their last message before walking away. That one moment gives the whole village a colder feeling, because it was not written as a farewell. It was written by people who still thought they were coming home. A short walk from Tyneham leads down to Wharram Bay, and that gives the village a strange contrast. The bay can feel quiet and peaceful, with open water, cliffs, and the Jurassic coast around it. But when you walk back towards the village, the mood changes. The coast feels alive and natural, while Tyneham feels paused. The church, the schoolhouse, and the ruined buildings remind you that this was once a working village, not just a place for visitors to pass through. That contrast does not make the coast creepy. It makes the village feel more abandoned when you return to it. Visitors often describe the village as eerie rather than frightening. One visitor said that on a misty day they found it eerie and creepy, especially because the school, church, and phone box felt intact, while the rest of the village sat in different stages of ruin. That is only one personal account, but it captures the feeling well. Tyneham is unsettling because it is not completely gone. It still gives you enough of a village to recognize what is missing. The village does not need an apparition at a window. Its ghost is the community itself. The people left expecting to return, and the buildings waited for a life that never came back. That is why Tyneham works as the final abandoned village in this chapter. Not because it screams horror, but because it leaves a quieter discomfort behind. A church with a message on the door. A school with no children returning. A village path leading down towards a beautiful bay. And all of it sitting there, more than 80 years later, like the place is still waiting for someone to come home.